Los Angeles nights carried a certain energy. The air buzzed with the hum of high-end sports cars rolling down Sunset Boulevard, their engines purring like well-fed lions outside the Sterling Club and exclusive members, only establishment known for. Its elite clientele, the rich and powerful, arrived in tailored suits and designer dresses, their laughter blending with the soft jazz playing inside the D-Man. A man in his late 40s, with a stiff black uniform and a gaze sharp enough to cut glass, stood by the entrance, scanning each guest with a careful, practiced eye, nodding to the ones he deemed worthy. Then he saw him Eamon approaching alone, dressed in a simple black hoodie, jeans, and a worn pair of sneakers. His hands tucked into his pockets, moving with an easy confidence that seemed almost out of place in a venue like this. The doorman's straightened his stance, shifting his weight slightly, his expression unreadable, but his intent clear. This man didn't belong here the moment he stepped closer. The doorman lifted a hand stopping him before he could even reach the velvet rope. "Sorry, sir," the doorman said, his voice polite but firm, the kind of tone used on someone who needed to understand their place. "This is a private club, members only." The man tilted his head slightly, studying the doorman as if assessing whether this was some kind of joke. Then he gave a small nod, the hint of a smile forming at the corner of his lips. Not smug, not offended, just patient. "I have a reservation," he said, simply, his voice smooth, calm, unbothered by the immediate dismissal. "Under Reeves, Keanu." Reeves, the doorman's mouth twitched. Something between amusement and disbelief flickering across his face. Then he exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. "Lookman?" he said, lowering his voice like he was doing the stranger a favor. "I don't know what kind of stunt you're trying to pull, but the Sterling Club doesn't do walk-ins, and it definitely doesn't do whatever this is. Reservations here are for real. Members, not for some guy in a hoodie who thinks he can talk his way." And a few guests waiting behind them began murmuring, throwing side glances at the scene unfolding before them. A woman in a sequined dress smirked, leaning in toward her friend as she whispered something behind her champagne glass. Another man in a navy suit checked his watch, sighing loudly. Clearly annoyed by the delay, Keanu's posture didn't change. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply reached into his back pocket, pulling out his phone, scrolling for a moment, then turning the screen toward the doorman. The reservation confirmation glowed under the soft golden light of the club's exterior. Keanu Reeves' VIP guest party of one. The doorman's jaw tightened. He took a step back, rubbing his fingers together as if contemplating his next move. He had made a mistake, but admitting it would mean losing face, and men like him didn't like to be wrong, especially not in front of an audience. "Yeah, well," the doorman finally muttered, barely glancing at the phone. "We have a dress code, sir. Sneakers aren't allowed." Keanu inhaled deeply, pressing his lips together as if suppressing a chuckle. It wasn't about the sneakers. It was never about the sneakers, but he had no interest in arguing with a man who had already decided he didn't belong. "All right," he said with a small nod, stepping back. "No problem." As he turned, something shifted in the energy around them. A man standing a few feet away had been watching the exchange closely. An older gentleman in an expensive suit, the kind of person who looked like he owned half the city. He let out a short, amused laugh, shaking his head. "Well, that was embarrassing," the man said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I mean, come on, buddy, did you really think they'd let you in here dressed like that?" A few chuckles rippled through the guests, soft but sharp, the kind of laughter made to sting. The man in the suit smirked, taking a slow sip from his glass before adding, "Tell you what, there's a burger joint down the street. They probably don't care what you're wearing." More laughter, this time from a group of younger men near the entrance, their expensive watches catching the light as they leaned into each other, nodding in agreement. Keanu turned back slightly, meeting the older man's gaze. For the briefest moment he could have said something, then could have wiped that smirk off his face with a single sentence, but instead he just smiled, a slow, knowing smile, one that made the laughter falter just slightly. Then without another word, he walked away. A few feet down the street, he spotted something, a high-end street vendor selling leather shoes, their polished surfaces gleaming under the city lights. Keanu walked over, pulling out his wallet, flipping through a few bills before handing them over. "How much for those?" he asked, nodding toward a sleek black pair. The vendor glanced down, hesitating for just a moment before giving a number. Keanu didn't haggle, didn't count the change, just handed over the cash, took the shoes and swapped them out right there on the sidewalk, tucking his sneakers into a small bag, before turning back toward the Sterling Club when he returned. The doorman's expression flickered with something unreadable. He opened his mouth, but before he could protest, Keanu lifted his foot slightly, tapping the heel against the pavement. "Better?" he asked, his voice light, almost teasing. The doorman hesitated, glancing past Keanu toward the club's interior, as if looking for backup. But there was none, only the quiet murmur of guests, some still watching, some pretending not to watch. Finally, after a beat too long, the doorman exhaled through his nose and begrudgingly lifted the velvet rope. "Welcome to the Sterling Club," he said, stiffly. Stepping aside, Keanu gave a small nod, stepping forward, passing through the entrance and into the warmth of the club's interior. But just before disappearing inside, he turned his head slightly, giving the suited businessman from earlier one last look. The man was still smirking, but something in his eyes had changed, like he wasn't quite as sure of himself anymore. The night was far from over, and things were about to get interesting. "What do you think is going to happen next? If you think they'll regret this, comment 9 below." Inside the Sterling Club, the atmosphere was a sharp contrast to the cool night outside. Warm amber lighting cascaded over the polished mahogany bar, reflecting off crystal glasses filled with top-shelf whiskey and aged wine. The air carried the scent of expensive cologne, seared FM, and just a touch of cigar smoke from the outdoor terrace. Jazz played softly in the background, adding to the quiet sophistication of the room. This was a place meant for those who belonged, those who carried their wealth and status like a second skin. Keanu took a slow step inside, letting his eyes scan the space, not in awe, not intimidated, just taking it in. The guests barely noticed him at first, too caught up in their own conversations, their own performances of grandeur. He moved toward the bar, walking with the same quiet confidence he always carried. But before he could reach it, a voice stopped him. "Sir," a sharp, clipped tone, professional but cold. Keanu turned to find a woman standing before him, her hair pulled into a severe bun. Her expression unreadable, but her stance said everything. This wasn't a welcome. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside," she said, her eyes flicking up and down, assessing him in a way that felt more clinical than polite. Keanu raised a brow. "Problem? We have a private event this evening," she replied smoothly. Folding her hands in front of her, he glanced around. The club was full, tables occupied, drinks flowing, conversation loud and unrestrained. There was no sign of an event taking place. He looked back at her, waiting. She hesitated just for a fraction of a second, but then recovered quickly. "Members only." Keanu didn't move. "I am a member." A pause. She wasn't expecting that. Her gaze flicked toward the entrance where the doorman was still stationed, shifting uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. She knew she had already lost this argument, but that didn't mean she was going to back down. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice tight, now less patient. "You're not on the list." Keanu sighed, pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled through his emails before holding up the screen. "Reservation confirmed. The Sterling Club VIP guest, Keanu Reeves." The woman's lips pressed into a thin line, and she forced a smile so tight it looked painful. She couldn't deny the evidence in front of her, but that didn't mean she had to make it easy. "Well," she said, stepping aside stiffly, "enjoy your evening." Keanu didn't respond, didn't gloat, didn't offer her a reassuring smile. He simply walked past her, heading toward the bar. It should have ended there, but it didn't. He took a seat, the leather bar stool sinking comfortably beneath him as he rested his arms on the polished surface of the counter. The bartender, a middle-aged man with graying hair and sharp eyes, approached with a practiced smile, one that vanished. The second got a proper look at his newest customer. Keanu didn't miss it. "What can I get you?" the bartender asked, though the warmth in his voice was already gone. "Whiskey neat," Keanu said easily. The bartender gave a slow nod but didn't move right away. Instead, his eyes flicked towards something or someone behind Keanu, a silent exchange happening in real time. Then, with deliberate slowness, he turned back, reaching for a bottle. A moment later, the drink was in front of him, but before he could even lift it, another voice cut through the air. "Excuse me." a woman's voice sharp and entitled. Keanu turned slightly in his seat. Finding a couple standing just a few feet away, the man wore a well-tailored navy suit, his watch glinting under the light. As he adjusted his cufflinks, the woman beside him was draped in a deep red dress, her diamonds catching the glow of the chandeliers, but it was her expression that stood out the most. Her lips curled in thinly veiled disapproval. Her gaze cool. And assessing this area is reserved, she said, tilting her chin slightly. Keanu glanced around, seeing no signs, no indications that the bar had any special restrictions for who the woman blinked, momentarily thrown off by his response for members. She said finally, like it was obvious. Keanu studied her for a moment before taking his glass and bringing it to his lips, sipping the whiskey slowly. Not breaking eye contact. "I am a member." A pause, a flicker of something in her eyes, annoyance, frustration, maybe even embarrassment. But she recovered quickly, letting out a breathy laugh, shaking her. "Well," she said, turning toward her companion, "I guess they'll let just about anyone in these days." The man beside her chuckled, shaking his head. "You hate to see it." Keanu exhaled softly, placing his glass back on the bar. The bartender still hadn't moved, watching the interaction with careful neutrality. "Too careful, tell me something," Keanu said, his tone light, almost conversational. "If I walked in here wearing a suit, would you still have a problem with me sitting here?" The woman arched a brow, not bothering to hide her disdain. "Now I think we both know the answer to that." There it was, the honesty behind the polished veneer. Keanu gave a small nod, barely there, as if filing away the moment. For later he could feel the eyes on him now, the subtle but undeniable shift in the room. Conversations had softened. People were listening without looking, trying to pretend they weren't invested, but they were. The air was charged, the tension building in slow, deliberate increments. If this were a scene in a movie, this would be the moment before everything changed. Keanu let the silence stretch just a little longer before he pushed back his chair, standing slowly. The bartender tensed. The woman in red tilted her head slightly, waiting for something. For him to leave maybe, or to argue. He did nay. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a few crisp bills, placing them on the counter before looking the bartender in the eye. "Keep the change." Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the dining area. It wasn't about the bar. It wasn't about the drink. It was about how much further they were willing to take this game, and how much they were going to regret it. Tonight was far from over. Keanu moved toward the dining area with an easy stride, unbothered but fully aware of the shift in atmosphere around him. He had felt this before, this kind of silent rejection. The way people didn't need to say the words out loud to make it clear that someone didn't belong. The conversations at the nearby tables didn't stop, but they slowed just enough to let him know they were listening. Watching, waiting for the next moment to pass judgment. He wasn't interested in making a scene, but he also wasn't about to back down. This wasn't about pride or proving a point. It was about seeing how far they would take it. The Maitre d', a tall silver-haired man in a perfectly pressed black suit, was speaking with a couple near the center of the room when he spotted Keanu heading toward the tables. His brows pulled together slightly, his eyes flashing with something between recognition and hesitation. Keanu had made a reservation. He had every right to be here, but the maitre was already calculating his next move, already deciding what excuse he'd use. Next, as Keanu reached the host stand, the maitre d' plastered on a carefully measured smile. "Good evening, sir," he said smoothly, his tone polite but not welcoming. "How may I assist you, Keanu?" Met his gaze, waiting just long enough for the silence to stretch. Before speaking, "Table for one," he said, his voice calm, steady. "Reservation under Reeves." The maitre exhaled lightly through his nose, so faint most people wouldn't have caught it. He turned slightly, glancing at the reservation list on his podium, running a finger down the page for show, even though Keanu knew his name was there. Then a pause, just a little too long. "I see," the metro said, finally lifting his head with an apologetic expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Unfortunately, there's been a small mix-up. Your table has been reserved for another party." Keanu studied him for a moment, tilting his head slightly. "Right, a mix-up. However," the metro continued quickly, as if to soften the blow, We do have a seat available at the bar." the same bar where he had just been treated like an outsider. Keanu let the words sit between them for a second before speaking. That won't work. For me, the maitre d' hesitated. He hadn't expected pushback, not in a place like this where people understood the unspoken rules. I understand, sir. He said, his voice still carefully composed. But unfortunately, we are at full capacity this evening, perhaps. We could offer you a table in the lounge instead. The lounge, another step down. Keanu smiled lightly. Not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable, the polite dismissal, the subtle push to get him to accept his place and move. A long no thanks, he said, tucking his hands into his pockets. I'll wait for my table. The matra stiffened slightly, glancing around the room as if hoping for some kind of support. A few guests at nearby tables were openly watching now, sipping their drinks with the kind of quiet interest reserved for a show they weren't sure would get good. One man, the same one from earlier. The wealthy businessman in the navy suit shook his head, chuckling under his breath. Unbelievable, he muttered, setting down his drink with an exaggerated, "See, I swear some people just don't know when to take a hint." Keanu heard it, of course he did, but he didn't react. Not yet. Instead, he turned back to the matra d'. How long's the wait? Another pause, another flicker of hesitation. It could be quite a while. The matra said smoothly, as if he had rehearsed this response 100 times before. Keanu nodded slowly. No problem. I've got time. The matra opened his mouth to argue, to find another excuse, another way to push him out, but before he could speak, a waiter suddenly approached carrying a fresh glass of wine toward the table where the businessman in navy was sitting. The businessman glanced up, still smirking, then turned to his wife. "You know, honey," he said just loud enough for Keanu to hear, "this reminds me of that time in Monaco. You remember when that street performer tried to get into the Gaia?" His wife laughed, taking a slow sip of her wine. "Oh yes, that was tragic." The couple at the next table chuckled along with them, shaking their heads as if they all understood something Keanu didn't. Keanu exhaled softly, glancing at the matra d' once more. "You sure there's no table available?" he asked again, his tone still light, but this time just slightly sharper. The matra d' hesitated just a moment, but it was enough. "I'm afraid not," he said finally. Keanu nodded as if accepting it. Then he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, scrolling through something briefly before tapping the screen. A few moments later, the Metro's own phone buzzed. He frowned, pulling it from his pocket when he looked at the screen, his face visibly paled. The smirking businessman and his wife stopped laughing. Their curiosity piqued as they watched the matri's expression change. "What is it?" the businessman asked, his voice just slightly less amused now. The matra swallowed hard, hesitating before looking up. "It's, He cleared his throat, forcing a tight smile. "It seems we've had another update." Keanu said nothing, just watching the matra straightened his posture. Suddenly more formal, his hands smoothing down the front of his suit as he turned toward Keanu. With a forced politeness, "Mr. Reeves," he said carefully, "it appears that your table is actually available after all." Silence. The businessman in navy shifted in his seat, his confident smirk not quite as sure anymore. Keanu lifted a brow, tucking his phone back into his pocket. "That's so." The matra nodded quickly, stepping aside and gesturing toward a prime table near the center of the room, the very one that had supposedly been taken just minutes ago. Keanu held his gaze for a moment before nodding. "All right, then," he said, "simply lead the way." As he walked past the businessman's table, he didn't bother looking at him, didn't offer a glance or a smirk. He didn't need to. The weight of the moment was already enough. The businessman shifted again, looking around at the other guests, but nobody was laughing anymore. They were all too busy watching Keanu take his seat at the best table in the house, and this night was far from over. The Sterling Club's finest table sat in the heart of the dining room, positioned just under an ornate chandelier that cast a warm golden glow over the polished mahogany. It was the kind of table that wasn't just given. It was reserved for the highest of high society, for those whose last names carried weight, whose presence alone signaled importance. And now Keanu Reeves was sitting there. He said, settled in, unhurried, adjusting the cuffs of his sleeves, as the matra stood beside him, his forced politeness Still tightly in place, your server will be right with you, Mr. Reeves, he said, his voice measured. Careful, Keanu nodded, offering nothing more. The maitre d' lingered for just a moment too long, as if debating whether to say more, then quickly turned and disappeared toward the back of the restaurant. The moment he left, the energy at the nearby tables shifted, guests' whispered eyes darting toward Keanu, before quickly looking away whenever he glanced up. The businessman in the navy suit was still watching his smirk, now replaced with something more unreadable. Curiosity, unease, maybe even a touch of regret, but Keanu wasn't concerned with any of them. He picked up the menu, flipping through the pages, leisurely taking his time, letting them wait just as they had made him wait. Minutes passed and then more. And yet no one came to take his order across the room. Waiters bustled between tables, delivering steaks seared to perfection, plates of oysters on ice, and bottles of the finest wine, but somehow his table remained untouched. Keanu leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose in amusement. So this was their next move. He wasn't surprised if they couldn't keep him out. They'd try to make him uncomfortable enough to leave on his own. Fine, he was patient. A few more minutes passed. Before awake, young, nervous, clearly reluctant, finally made his way toward the table, a notepad clutched in his hand. Good evening, sir," he said hesitantly, his eyes flicking toward the bar where the manager stood watching. "Can I get you something to drink?" Keanu closed the menu with a quiet snap, resting it on the table. "I'll have whatever the gentleman in the navy suit is drinking," he said, simply tipping his head slightly toward the businessman across the room. The waiter hesitated. That's a 1961 Chateau Latour, sir," he said carefully. "It's quite expensive." Keanu just raised a brow, waiting. The waiter swallowed, nodding quickly. "Right, one Chateau Latour coming up." He turned to leave, but before he could take a step, another voice cut in actually. A new voice, smooth, clipped, authoritative, the club's manager. A man in his 50s with a perfectly pressed black vest and an expression that screamed exclusivity stepped into view. "That bottle is reserved for members." Keanu looked up, expression unreadable. "I am a member." A pause, yes. But the manager forced a tight smile. "That particular bottle is allocated for regular patrons." Keanu exhaled softly, his lips twitching into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Regular patrons?" "Yes, sir, all right," Keanu said easily. "Then I'll take the house red." The manager's expression relaxed just slightly, thinking that maybe, just maybe, he had managed to put Keanu in his place, but then, oh wait. Keanu continued, his voice still light, still calm, but his eyes sharp. "That's not reserved for regular patrons too. Is it?" The manager's jaw tightened ever so slightly, and there was a shift in the air, one subtle enough that only those truly paying attention would have noticed. "Of course not, sir," he said finally, forcing another smile. "Great," Keanu said, leaning back. "Then I'll take that." The manager nodded stiffly, then gestured for the waiter to proceed. The young man scurried off quickly, disappearing toward the bar, eager to get away from the growing tension at the table. Keanu watched him go, then turned back toward the manager still standing. "They're still lingering just a little too long." "Anything else?" Keanu asked, his tone polite. "Too polite." The manager hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sir." Keanu nodded once, then picked up the menu. Again, "Great," he said, flipping it open. "Then let's get to the food." Silence. The manager didn't move. Keanu glanced up, lifting a brow. "Was there something else?" The manager hesitated just a beat too long, then cleared his throat. "There might be an issue with that," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. Keanu waited. The manager cleared his throat again. "Running a limited menu tonight, is that right?" "Yes, sir." Keanu nodded slowly, as if processing. "All right," he said, still calm. "Then I'll take whatever's available." Another pause. "Well," the manager shifted, "that's the thing, we actually just sold out of most of our entree." Keanu smiled lightly, because of course they did. "What about appetizers?" asked casually. The manager's lips pressed together briefly, as if he knew exactly where this was going. "Unfortunately, we're also low on those this evening," he said, his voice growing tighter. Keanu exhaled softly, setting the menu down. "So let me get this straight," he said, his voice still calm, still polite, but with just a little more weight behind it. "Now the bar doesn't have what I want, the kitchen doesn't have what I want. And yet somehow every other table seems to have food and drinks. Just fine silence. The manager had no good answer. Instead, he opened his mouth, then closed it again. Keanu just watched him, waiting for a long moment. Nobody spoke then without a word. Keanu pulled out his phone. The manager visibly tensed. His eyes flicking toward it, Keanu scrolled briefly, then tapped the screen a few. Moments later, a chime sounded. The manager's phone buzzed in his pocket. He froze across the room. The Matra D's phone buzzed too. So did the bartender's. The businessman in navy looked over. Now curiosity flickering across his face. The manager's throat bobbed as he swallowed, slowly reaching for his phone. When he looked at the screen, his face drained of color. Keanu tilted his head slightly. Waiting, the manager forced himself to breathe, forcing a smile that was even shakier than before. "Mr. Reeves," he said, carefully, his voice suddenly much softer. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Keanu exhaled, tossing his phone lightly onto the table, watching as the man practically withered under his gaze. "No," Keanu said finally, leaning forward just slightly. "I think you understood perfectly." And just like that, the entire night shifted. The Sterling Club, a place where power and wealth dictated status, was suddenly holding its breath. The moment stretched tense and unspoken as the manager stood, frozen, gripping his phone like it might save him from the inevitable. Nearby, the Mat D and bartenders stared at their own screens, their faces flickering with the same realization. Whatever Keanu had done, whatever message he had sent, it had changed everything. The businessman in the navy suit, still seated at his table, leaned forward slightly. His curiosity piqued. "Well," he muttered under his breath, swirling the wine in his glass. "This just got interesting." Keanu remained seated, calm, his posture unshaken, his expression unreadable. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a scene he hadn't needed to. The weight of his presence alone had already shifted the entire room. The manager finally forced a tight breath, plastering on a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Reeves," he started, his voice measured but shaky. I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience tonight. There's clearly been a miscommunication." Keanu arched a brow but said nothing. The manager continued quickly, desperate to control the damage. "We'd be more than happy to accommodate you properly. A meal on the house, perhaps. I don't need a free meal." Keanu interrupted, his voice soft but firm, the kind that cut through the noise without needing to be loud. The manager swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "Of course, right away, sir. I'll personally ensure no." Keanu said, holding up a hand. The man stopped mid-sentence, his breath hitching slightly. Keanu sat forward, clasping his hands together on the table, his gaze steady, unreadable but undeniably present. "What I need," he said, his voice slow, deliberate, "is to understand something." The room remained silent, all attention now locked on him. "Let's say I wasn't Keanu Reeves," he continued, his tone light, but his meaning heavy. "Let's say I was just another guy, not famous, not wealthy, just a regular person, someone who walked in off the street." The manager's Adam's apple bobbed his silence, answering the question before he even spoke. Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Would you have treated me the same?" A pause, a thick, suffocating pause. The manager fumbled for an answer, but Keanu didn't need to hear it. He already knew, so did everyone else. And that's when it happened. A phone chimed, again, then another. Then another. The businessman in navy's own phone buzzed. And when he pulled it out, his brows lifted slightly in surprise. "Well," he murmured, setting his glass down. "Would you look at that? The staff weren't the only ones getting the notifications now. The guests, the bystanders, they were seeing it too." Social media was already on fire. Keanu's name was trending. The headline: "A-list actor denied service at exclusive club." A shocking display of discrimination. Someone had leaked it. Maybe it was a staff member, maybe a guest, but it didn't matter. Now the damage was done. Keanu leaned back slightly, watching as the realization sank in. The club was about to become famous for all the wrong reasons. People were already talking, questioning, judging. The manager's face had gone pale, his hands slightly trembling as he scrolled through his phone. Probably praying it was some kind of mistake. It wasn't Keanu let the silent stretch, letting them sit in it, letting them feel the weight of their choices. Then after what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "I think I've had enough for tonight," he said simply. Standing up, the manager immediately panicked. "Mr. Reeves, please." Keanu held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "I'm not interested in apologies," he said, his voice steady because they wouldn't exist. "If you didn't know who I was." The room was still dead. Silent Noon dared to move. Keanu took a slow breath, then with no anger, no theatrics, she turned and walked toward the exit as he passed the navy-suited businessman's table. He paused just for a second, just enough for the man to shift uncomfortably. In his seat, Keanu didn't look at him, didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Then, with the same calm energy he had walked in with, he left. And the Sterling Club. Well, their night was just beginning the moment Keanu stepped out of the Sterling Club. The tension inside the building didn't dissipate. It thickened, spreading like wildfire through the room. Conversations that had once been murmured exploded into frantic whispers. Staff exchanged panicked glances. And the manager. Well, the manager looked like he had just watched his entire career collapse in real time. The businessman in the navy suit leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. Slowly, lips pressed together in something that wasn't quite a smirk but wasn't sympathy either. "I got to say," he muttered, swirling the last bit of wine in his glass. "That might have been the worst business move I've seen in a long time." The manager ignored him, his phone vibrating relentlessly in his pocket when he pulled it out. His stomach dropped at the notifications flooding. His screen articles were already being written. Social media was already tearing them apart. He tapped one of the links with shaky fingers. Keanu Reeves denied entry to elite law club, discriminatory policies exposed. He scrolled down. The article had already racked up hundreds of comments, people demanding answers, calling for boycott, dragging the Sterling Club's name through the mud. And then there was the real kicker. One of the top replies, it was a video. Someone had filmed the entire thing. The moment Keanu walked up, the way the staff dismissed him, the manager's fake politeness, the denied service, and finally, the parting words that left the room in silence. It was all there, and it was going viral. His hands clenched around the phone as he turned to the Matra. "D, get him back in here now." The Matra D blinked. "Excuse me, you heard me." The manager snapped his composure, slipping. "For the first time all night, go after him. Apologize, offer him anything, hell, comp his membership for life. If you have to, just fix this." The Matra hesitated for just a moment too long, and the manager's fury sharpened. "What are you waiting for?" he hissed. The Matra nodded quickly, rushing toward the entrance. Keanu wasn't rushing, he never rushed, but he also wasn't lingering. He had come to see how far they would go, and they had gone exactly as far as he expected. There was nothing left to say. The night air was cool against his skin as he walked toward the valet stand, his hands tucked casually into his jacket pockets. A few passers-by glanced in his direction, recognizing him but not stopping him. It was law after all, and Thessaly was no stranger to celebrity sightings. The valet, a young guy in his early 20s, saw him approaching and instantly straightened, fumbling slightly as he grabbed the keys to Keanu's bike. Mr. Reeves, sir," Keanu offered, a small, genuine smile. "Take your time, man." The valet nodded quickly, moving toward the row of high-end vehicles with a little too much urgency. Keanu exhaled, stretching his fingers ready to put the night behind him. "Mr. Reeves." The voice came from behind Keanu. Didn't turn immediately, just let the moment hang for a beat before glancing over his shoulder. The Matra was hurrying toward him, his posture still poised but his steps just a little too rushed, like a man trying to look like he wasn't desperate when he absolutely was. Keanu shifted slightly, his expression unreadable. "Something I can do for you." The Matra D stopped just a few feet away, exhaling sharply before forcing a strained smile. "Mr. Reeves," he started, "I want to sincerely apologize for the events of this evening. There was a miscommunication." Keanu said nothing, just watched. The Matra D swallowed hard before continuing. We'd like to invite you back inside," he said quickly. "Of course, as our most valued guest, whatever you'd like on the house." Silence. Keanu tilted his head slightly, considering. Then after a moment, No. The matra blinked, caught off guard, sir, I know. Keanu repeated, his voice still calm, still quiet, but final. The matra opened his mouth, floundering for words. But Keanu had already turned back toward the valet. We deeply regret. I'm sure you do, Keanu said lightly. Not even looking back, a second later the valet pulled up with Keanu's black Norton Commando, the engine purring like a satisfied animal as the young man hopped off quickly, handing over the keys. Here you go, sir, the valet said, still a little astruck. Keanu took the keys with a nod, reaching into his pocket and handing the kid a crisp 100 bill. The valet eyes widened slightly. Whoa, Mr. Reeves? This is take it, Keanu said, and then because the kid had nothing to do with the night's events, he actually smiled. You're the only person in that place who didn't try to pretend they were better than someone else. The valet beamed, clutching the bill like he had just been handed a winning lottery ticket. Keanu straddled, the bite gripped the handlebars, and with one last glance toward the Sterling Club, where the Matra D still stood at the entrance. Awkward, desperate, and too late to fix what had already been done, he revved the engine. Then he was gone. The deep, throaty roar of the bike, cutting through the silence like a final statement. The Mater D re-entered the club, his face tight, his movements stiff. The manager watched him approach, already knowing from the look on his face that it was over. The businessman in navy shook his head, slowly leaning back in his chair. Well, he murmured, his lips curving into a smirk that didn't go. How you planned, did it? The manager didn't answer his phone. Buzzed again. And when he looked down, he felt his stomach sink even further. More news articles, more comments, more outrage. It wasn't just a bad night anymore. It was a full-blown PR disaster. And the worst part, they had done it to themselves by morning. The headlines had spread like wildfire. Exclusive lay club faces back backlash after disrespecting Hollywood icon Keanu Reeves denied service. The internet isn't having it. What happened at the Sterling Club will shock you. The Sterling Club's social media pages were flooded with thousands of comments, people calling for boycotts, for staff to be fired, for real change, and Keanu, he didn't post about it. Didn't comment, didn't say a single word because he didn't have to. The world had already spoken for him. The morning sun spilled across the glossy windows of the Sterling Club, but inside the atmosphere was anything but bright. The club's usual, routine staff polishing glassware setting, pristine white tablecloths preparing for another night of luxury, was shattered by the ringing of phones, frantic murmurs, and the sinking realization that their exclusivity had turned into a liability overnight. The manager sat in his office, fingers tensed around his phone, scrolling through article after article. Keanu Reeves denied service. Sterling Club faces backlash. Hollywood's favorite actor treated like an outsider. The internet is furious. The Sterling Club learns a hard lesson about judging a book by its cover. The comments were even worse. Cancel this club. Disgusting. Keanu is literally the nicest guy on earth, and this is how they treated him. No surprise, these elite clubs always expose themselves sooner or later. Boycott. The PR team had already called twice, demanding immediate damage control. High-profile members were already withdrawing their reservations, unwilling to be associated with what was quickly becoming the biggest scandal in LA's social scene. And worst of all, Keanu Reeves hadn't even said a word about it. The manager exhaled sharply, slamming his phone onto his desk. For the first time in his career, he wasn't just dealing with an angry customer, he was dealing with an entire movement against him. A knock at the door made him snap his head up. The Matra D stepped in, his face tense, his usual poise nowhere to be found. We have a situation, he said, voice stiff. The manager gritted his teeth. What now? The Matra D hesitated, as if debating whether to even say it, then finally gestured toward the hallway. You should see for yourself. The manager rose reluctantly, pushing open the door and following him out as soon as they turned the corner into the main dining area. His stomach dropped there. Standing in a small group by the entrance were reporters, cameras, microphones, and outside even more of them. Dozens of people hovering around the entrance, waiting, watching, hungry for a statement. What the hell? The manager hissed, rubbing his temples. How did they even get in? They didn't. The Matra D muttered. They're with the press, they're demanding answers. The manager turned toward the door again, jaw tight outside. The press was already starting to call out, are you issuing an apology? Do you have a statement on the Keanu Reeves incident? Was it discrimination or just poor judgment? The waiters, the bartender, 7 the guests who had come in for lunch, everyone was frozen watching the unfolding disaster. Like it was a movie scene playing out in real time. The manager forced his shoulders back, schooling his face into the most neutral expression he could manage before finally stepping forward. "Good morning, everyone," he started, lifting a hand as if to calm the chaos. "We aware of the recent report, and we'd like to clarify a few things." Cameras clicked, reporters leaned in. "The Sterling Club has always prided itself on hospitality and excellence." He continued, his voice carefully measured, rehearsed, and unfortunately last night, there was a miscommunication that led to a regrettable situation. A reporter near the front scoffed. "A miscommunication," she repeated. "Is that what you're calling it?" The manager stiffened. Another journalist cut in, holding up her phone. "So is this fake?" Then she challenged, "Because I have a full video of your staff refusing Keanu Reeves' service, denying him a table and giving him excuse after excuse not to eat here." She turned the phone around. The video played. Right there in front of him, the scene from the night before, unfolding in brutal clarity. Keanu, standing there calm, waiting, the staff dismissing him the moment he was told the food was mysteriously unavailable. His final words before walking out the manager's throat went dry before he could even come up with a response. Another reporter asked, "Are you aware that over 20 people have already signed a petition to revoke your business license?" A petition. The manager felt his breath catch. This wasn't just a scandal anymore. This was escalating into something that could actually shut them down. He started, but what was there to say they had done it to themselves? He forced a tight smile, grasping for some kind of control. "The Sterling Club will be issuing an official apology later today," he announced, voice clipped now. "If you'll excuse me, but the questions kept coming. Are you only apologizing because you got caught? Is Keanu Reeves banned from this establishment? Are you going to change your policies on who gets service here?" The manager turned sharply on his heel, walking away before they could press further, his heart pounding in his chest behind him. The meter let out a slow breath, watching the reporters through the glass doors. "Well," he muttered under his breath, "I think that could have gone worse." The manager shot him a glare. The matra shrugged slightly. "Could have been better too, though." The manager gritted his teeth, storming back toward his office. This was not over yet. By late afternoon, Keanu's name was still trending. People were sharing their own stories of being rejected at elite venues, talking about class ISM discrimination and how people are treated based on appearances. And through it all, Keanu didn't say a word. He didn't post. He didn't comment. He didn't do a single interview. He didn't need to, because the world was already speaking. For him and the Sterling Club, they were learning the hardest lesson of all. The sun was beginning to set over Los Angeles, bathing the city in a golden glow. But inside the Sterling Club, the mood was anything but warm. The once exclusive venue, which had prided itself on catering to the city's wealthiest and most powerful, was now experiencing something it had never faced before: public scrutiny on a massive scale. Phones rang off the hook. Emails flooded and reservations were being canceled by the hour. The manager sat at his desk, his suit jacket thrown over the chair, his tie loosened, beads of sweat forming at his temple as he stared at the club's official statement on his laptop screen. It had taken them all day to craft it, a carefully worded, insincere apology that blamed the situation on miscommunication and unintentional oversight. It was damage control at its most desperate, but it wasn't working. The comments under their social media posts were brutal. "This is the worst non-apology I've ever seen. Too late, the world already saw what happened. Oh, now you're sorry, when your money is on the line. Keanu doesn't even have to say anything and you guys are falling apart." LOL, the manager clenched his jaw, scrolling through the avalanche of criticism. Then the real blow came. An email subject: immediate termination of membership partnership. He clicked it open, his stomach twisting as he read, "Dear Sterling Club Management, due to the events of last night and the overwhelming public response, we regret to inform you that our partnership with the Sterling Club has been terminated, effective immediately. As a brand, we do not align ourselves with businesses that promote exclusivity at the expense of Human dignity, sincerely. Luxury Partners Incorporated, the Sterling Club's most lucrative sponsor, had just pulled out. The manager shoved back his chair, running a hand through his hair, muttering a string of curses under his breath, and then another email arrived. This one from a prominent law firm. He clicked on it, skimming the words, his face draining of color. The Sterling Club was now being investigated for discriminatory practices. Keanu sat at a quiet cafe tucked into the corner of acid-drenched patio, stirring a cup of coffee with slow, absent-minded motion. She wasn't looking at his phone, wasn't caught up in the media firestorm unfolding around the Sterling Club, because to him it was already done. He had seen it before, how power shifted, how people revealed who they truly were. They thought someone had nothing to offer them, and then when they realized their mistake, the panic, the scrambling, the desperate attempts to undo what couldn't be undone. But he had no interest in watching them self-destruct. He had walked away, without saying a word, and yet his silence had done more damage to them than any public statement ever could. A server approached his table, placing down a fresh plate of food on the house, she said with a smile. Keanu glanced up, raising a brow. "You? Don't have to do that, I know," she said, shrugging, "but we wanted to." He studied her for a moment, then smiled, a real smile this time, before picking up his fork, because this, a simple act of kindness given without expectation, was worth more than anything the Sterling Club had ever tried to offer him, and somewhere across the city in a now quiet, members-only club, they were just beginning to realize what they had lost. The Sterling Club, once a sanctuary for LA's elite, now felt eerily empty. The usual symphony of clinking glasses and murmured conversations was replaced by silence, broken only by the occasion ringing phone. A call that would undoubtedly bring more bad news. The manager sat at the bar, his suit wrinkled, his tie loosened, staring at a half-empty glass of whiskey that he barely had the stomach to drink. The maitre d' stood beside him, scrolling through his phone with a grim expression. "This is bad," the maitre d' muttered. "Really bad." The manager scoffed. "You think I don't know that?" He ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. "How much worse has it gotten?" The maitre hesitated, then turned his phone screen toward him. The manager grimaced at the headlines. "The Sterling Club's worst PR nightmare. Can they recover? High-end members. Cancel." In droves, following Keanu Reeves' incident, when exclusivity becomes exclusion. How one club ruined its own reputation overnight. The Sterling Club was no longer being talked about as a place of prestige. It was now a cautionary tale. And it wasn't just. The media luxury brands were cutting ties. Wealthy patrons were disassociating themselves, and even regular staff members, the ones who had nothing to do with last night's disaster, were quitting, not wanting to be part of a sinking ship. The manager downed the rest of his drink, slamming the glass onto the bar. The worst part, Keanu Reeves hadn't said a single word about any of it. Not one interview, not one post. He hadn't needed to. The world had spoken. For him, the maitre d' cleared his throat. "We should probably issue another statement?" The manager let out a bitter laugh. "A statement? You think that's going to fix this?" The maitre shifted awkwardly. "Well, it's not like we can just do nothing." The manager shook his head, rubbing his temples. He thought back to that moment last night when Keanu had sat at the bar, when he had asked just one simple question. "If I weren't Keanu Reeves, would you have treated me the same?" And the truth they had all known but refused to say out loud was now the reason their entire business was falling apart. The manager let out a long breath, staring down at the empty glass in front of him for the first time. He had nothing to say. Keanu stood outside a small bookstore, hands in his jacket pockets, watching as an elderly shop owner helped a young boy count out his coins at the register. The boy was a few dollars short, his face falling as he realized he couldn't afford the book he wanted. The shop owner, without hesitation, slid the book into a bag and handed it to him anyway. Keanu smiled, no questions, no judgment, just kindness. He walked into the shop, grabbed a book, and approached the counter. The elderly woman looked up, smiling. "Find everything okay?" Keanu nodded, placing the book down. "Yeah," he handed her a $100 bill. She started counting the change, but Keanu shook his head. "Keep it." he said, nodding toward the little boy who was already flipping through the pages of his book. Beaming, the shop owner's eyes softened. Understanding. Thank you, she said. Quietly, Keanu just smiled, tucking his hands back into his pockets as he stepped outside. Some people measured status in wealth, in power, in exclusivity, but real value, real worth that was found in the smallest, simplest moments of kindness. And as Keanu walked down the quiet street, leaving the noise of the Sterling Club behind for good, he knew exactly who had won that night.